We'll wait till we get a few people to join us live here, and then once we get some live viewers, we'll see if if the audio issues have been resolved or not. Hey, if you're in the chat and you can hear me, please let me know. Do we have audio? Do we have audio? Yay. All right. Good deal. So this is round two. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. This is Around the Nation with Jeff Waldorf. I am obviously not Jeff Waldorf. My name's Jordan French, the Regressive Progressive, friend of Jeff's. He wasn't able to make it today, or tomorrow actually. So I will be your host today, and not that I have Jeff's studio or equipment or acumen for the job, but I'm who you got, so you get to deal with it. Appreciate it if you bear with me. Obviously, we've already had audio issues today, but we'll try to do the show justice. So we got a good show for you today. A few different stories that we'll be checking out include the problems with the U.S. Census. Not necessarily what you might think, though. Possible catfight within the GOP, maybe not. U.S. Aid cuts to Palestine, why that happened and some of the consequences, and a new development with the Catholic Church. Yeah, give me a second to get everything set up and we'll get that started. All right, so our story here, our top story today, we'll go ahead and lead with the kind of work our way backwards from the rundown I just gave. So today, the Catholic Church has formally made its position clear that it is against the death penalty. This is an official shift for the church, which has basically kind of had a softer stance against the death penalty in the past, while officially acknowledging that it could be used as a means of safeguarding the common good in response to certain specific crimes. But today, Pope Francis has approved the change to and updated the Catholic Catechism that officially reverses that stance, using the phrase, the recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. They've go on to say there's increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. It also cites new understanding that has emerged on the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state, and that more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. So there's a lot kind of baked into that statement. There's kind of some recognition of things that are going on in the world and new developments that have kind of been researched and bore themselves out, and looking at the data in terms of what the state can do to deter crime and what's effective and what's not. So the basis for it, obviously, the first statements they give there speak to the dignity of the human being not being affected by their actions, and that goes into the Christian doctrine of the idea of human beings being created in the image of God, and that our worth as human beings has nothing to do with our station in life or what we've done, but that we are created in God's image, and that nothing that we can do, is enough to detract from that or to destroy that in a person so much that it's okay to kill them. And then the other things that they get into there are obviously we've got the data shows that there's much more effective deterrence. And in fact, the death penalty is not much of a deterrent because it gives you a false out. This gives us a way to basically to stop a conversation about a problem, because you just get to, you in the life of the person that's done something, and it gives you a catharsis, and it gives you your pound of flesh, but you don't do anything to address a larger systemic issue that might be behind the crime. Certainly some crimes are just, acts of just depraved people, but most of the time there's something going on there. There's some issue that facilitated, or a multitude of factors that work together to create, the situation that led somebody to make what was ultimately an evil decision. And the church has gone to recognize that, and to understand that there's there's a more effective, all theology aside, there's more effective means to address even violent crimes, and the church is, kind of putting their official stamp of approval on that. And then the other thing there, that they don't explicitly come out and say, but it's kind of in philosophy professor, pointed out. So my background, unlike Jeff and pretty much everyone else on TYT Network, I am a Christian, and I actually studied theology and biblical studies. That's what I went to college for. And in our ethics class, we had a section on the death penalty or whatever, and I took a pretty strong stance against it. And my professor made a point that it wasn't something I agreed with, but something that I could respect, was that, there might be a place for the death penalty if we always got it right. Just that in the world we live in now, the impetus to protect innocent life is such an important calling and duty, that there may be, as the Catholic Church Catechism said, after a fair trial, there might be an appropriate, albeit extreme, means of repercussion for those actions. But the thing is, not everybody gets a fair trial, right? Like, what we know now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is how many people go to death row. Or excuse me, I should rephrase that. We don't know how many people. We know that a large number of people, an unacceptable number of people, not that one would be acceptable, but an unacceptable number of people go to death row and are executed by the state, and then are later exonerated. And those are just the ones we catch. Who knows how many we didn't? And so the church is the Catholic Church has kind of acknowledged this reality. And again, this is kind of an official thing. The Catholic Church, with some exceptions, based on geography, has held up against the death penalty for quite some time, although they haven't had an official stance against it. But they're kind of acknowledging that reality, and the idea that there's more effective means, and that the gravity of ending a life and being wrong is too much of a risk. And this isn't in what they say, but this is kind of the big thing that convinced me to ultimately just decide against being in favor of the death penalty, was that the whole philosophical premise for the death penalty is, we normally use it in the case of people who have taken lives unjustly. And so the premise there, the entire foundation, is that if something is willing to take an innocent life, then it's acceptable for that to be destroyed as a repercussion. So if someone is willing to kill someone, it's acceptable for them to be killed, either as punishment or to prevent them from doing it again. And by that same thought, the death penalty kills innocent people. We know this. People have been exonerated after their death sentences are carried out. And so by that same thinking, the death penalty is a self-defeating philosophy, because it kills innocent people. Therefore, the death penalty should be abolished. And that's, without getting into any of the theological underpinnings and the whole image of God argument, I think that's kind of a universal truth or universal argument that really kind of defeats any stance or anything the death penalty has going for it. Now, as I've mentioned a few times, the Catholic Church, unlike evangelicals who have historically embraced the death penalty in America, the Catholic Church has kind of had, like I said, a soft stance against it, despite officially allowing for it to potentially being a legitimate tool the state has. In 1995, Pope John Paul II said, talked about growing evidence of opposition against the death penalty, and even in places where there is, a legitimate defense of the death penalty, there's still kind of a growing sentiment against it. And he called that a sign of hope. So this is, 23 years before the Catholic Church had, made this stance official. The leader of the church was already hopeful that this was, the direction that we were heading. And the world is, the Catholic Church is kind of moving along with the world on this one. There were last year, according to Amnesty International, there were about 993 executions across the world, across the planet. And again, these are official, legal state-sanctioned executions after trials and everything. This isn't, we're not talking about state genocides or massacres or anything like that, which are, tragedies in and of themselves for horrific other reasons. But that 993 number is down 4% from the previous year. So we're moving in the right direction on this. There may be some pushback in the church on this, though, and of course, the United States of America. Our Conference of Bishops tends to be a little bit more conservative than bishops, particularly European bishops and South American bishops. African bishops can kind of hang with us in terms of their conservative, bona fides, but there's there is a if there is a holdout that will kind of push back against this, we'll probably see it from the American Conference of Bishops, but it's not something that they can overturn by themselves. This will be the binding teaching in the Catechism. And then finally, here's I'll close this segment with a quote from the Pope that he wrote last month. That he to kind of take this out, he kind of played his hand that this was coming, and maybe you be the judge. I report, you decide. Made a little bit of a jab at our president, but he said a person's dignity does not depend on them being a citizen, a migrant, or a refugee. Saving the life of someone fleeing war and poverty is an act of humanity. And that ties into this. Obviously, he's not speaking about the death penalty there, but the idea of your dignity doesn't depend upon your legal status. It doesn't depend on, what you've done or what you haven't done, but that human beings have a dignity. And again, if you're a Christian, that comes from the belief that the image of God is what we are created in. And that's something that doesn't go away. So that's, there's that. Hopefully we can continue to get our government on board with this, and other kind of holdouts that still are pro death penalty, and this is a direction that it's really refreshing to see the church move in officially and make it their official teaching. Moving on from the Catholic Church, why not? We'll go on to Palestine, to the effect of U.S. aid cuts, and a little bit more of that, a little bit more than that, just kind of on how they were rolled out or not rolled out, and what this could mean for us. So just brief background, the United States has long, for years, in fact, going back to at least 1994, we have been the biggest source of aid for both in terms of development and programs, as well as just humanitarian aid, than any other country. However, in 2018, that has changed. The Trump administration, in response to, well, I don't want to bury the lead there. The Trump administration has decided to withhold millions of dollars in aid for the Palestinians, including humanitarian aid. And that's important because what I think a lot of people don't realize is that we actually fund a lot of Palestinian defense spending. We provide money for their police forces and some of their other defense spending to help, kind of tamp down unrest and everything, and to give them a semblance of law and order as much as you can in a state that lacks a lot of basic necessities. But we haven't just withheld that aid. We've withheld flat, straight up humanitarian aid that wasn't even delivered through the, the Palestinian Authority, but was delivered through local charities, many, if not most of them, religious. And so the reason for this, why we're withholding this aid, at least on this massive scale, is what's kind of is particularly troubling. So obviously, we've had issues with Palestine, launching rockets to Israel, and then Israel responding with a much, much, much higher escalation of force that most people, I think, would, if they, when viewed objectively, would see that as an unjust response. Especially while the U.S. funded Iron Dome, renders the rockets and missiles that Palestine launches, to be completely ineffective. And then Israel comes back and kills, dozens, if not hundreds of Palestinians. But all that said, the act of launching rockets into a sovereign state, is an act of terrorism or an act of war, depending on, the context and the situation it happens in. And so if somebody is launching rockets against your allies, it's understandable that you might cut off humanitarian aid. That's not what, or you might cut off aid. Humanitarian aid's a little different story. But that's not even what this is for. The grave sin that Palestine committed was basically they insulted Donald Trump. So whenever Trump, made the announcement that we were moving our embassy to Jerusalem, a move that really changed nothing in terms of how we operate, which was what Trump tried to use as a justification for it, but if anything is an indictment of it. It didn't change anything anyway in how we operated. All it did was, stir up animosity in the region and make things more difficult. So whenever Trump announced that, then the Palestinian Authority said that it would boycott the Trump administration. And to be fair, also the Israeli-Palestinian peace efforts, because of, basically one of the big things that the debate is over in the peace talks is who gets Jerusalem, and Trump basically took that off the table. And so since they offended Trump's sensibilities by talking bad about him and saying they would boycott it, he decided to withhold aid from hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who need it to survive. Because Trump plays fair. So he tweeted out this, some tweets. I'm not gonna give them the respect of reading them. But back in January, he kind of laid the groundwork for this. And in true Trump fashion, at least as far as I know, there was no official statement put out. What we have were a tweet in January, and then, as best we can tell, based on what we hear from the charities and NGOs in Palestine, they think that funding started getting cut in January. Because the Trump administration is incompetent, there was no official rollout to this. There wasn't a clear statement made. There was no policy put in place. It was just kind of Trump tweeted about it, and then charities noticed that their funding started drying up. This is something that aid to a country is a bargaining tool. It is a chip that we use. That's kind of politics 101, whether that's right or wrong. The Obama administration, occasionally would take back funding and humanitarian aid and other aid projects off the table during, whenever a round of rockets had just been launched, and in order to kind of ease the tensions that inevitably developed after that, and the fighting that would spring up for a few weeks after that. Then they would put sanctions back on, or put the aid back on the table as a carrot to get them to come back to the table and back to peace negotiations. But again, it was orchestrated. It was intentional. There was an end game to it. It was not this just kind of nebulous, governing by tweet and then no notification to the people on the ground there. Who are there doing good work and trying to help people, and then all of a sudden their funding starts drying up and they're not given any rhyme or reason for it. And of course, we're still giving tons of aid to Israel, more than any other country since World War II. So think about that: the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, all the money that we poured into West Europe to be a bulwark against the spread of communism. We've still given more money to Israel in the time since. This is kind of what I wanted to get into here. So let's look at some of the things that this funding, and what this freeze is really affecting, kind of as much as we can nail down targeted areas, since there hasn't been an actual rollout and good, delivery of this policy. But what's going away are eye surgeries. There's a Catholic hospital in Gaza where surgeons specialize in removing cataracts and other kind of cutting edge eye surgery procedures, as well as training doctors there in Palestine to help their own people. And there's stickers in Arabic, on all the equipment and stuff like that is being used to, save the eyesight of these people, that say things like from the American people. There's a very clear understanding that, the Palestinians that go there know, where this money's coming from, and that it's the American people who are helping to heal them. And that's no longer there. As well as obviously food is a pretty basic humanitarian assistance. So of course that's going to get cut. About half of the population in Gaza lives underneath the poverty line. And so Catholic Relief Services reports to NPR that the U.S. Funding freeze means it no longer has food vouchers to provide for Palestinians there. One Palestinian that the NPR report quotes by name is a woman by the name of Manal Fassi, and she lists that she used those U.S. funded food vouchers to buy cheese, halwa, spices, tomatoes, pasta, noodles, sugar, rice. She says, everything we needed for the home they gave us. May God bless them. This is a Palestinian woman speaking about the United States of America. Now she goes to her cabinet, and when she opens it up, it's empty. Her husband is an unemployed fisherman. He can't, he's not able to work right now because of the situation on the ground. Like I say, half the population there is unemployed. And he said, he's quoted as saying in the same NPR report that, this is humanitarian aid for people who need it. Shouldn't have anything to do with politics, he said. And that, that goes back to our previous story, that the dignity of human beings and what our duty as those who have to help those who have not, should transcend political disagreements, and that what the leadership does in a place like Gaza should not affect the people who have no say in such matters. And then the last big cut that happens here are job cuts. So about half of Gaza's workforce is without jobs, as I said. Now, so a lot of people, and Trump made this argument in those tweets, we give all this money, they need to help themselves. Well, here's the thing. These may be American aid groups that are delivering, that are the vehicle through which this charity gets organized. The people that come there and open up these clinics are Americans, but they hire from the local population. Right? It doesn't make sense to have to ship all your workers in from across the world whenever you're, trying to provide aid. One of the main things you can do, one of the best ways to uplift a people is to bring them work and a steady paycheck, right? And so that comes through U.S. funding. It's we're subsidizing the jobs at these hospitals and at these food delivery services and operations. And now they don't have jobs. And so what happens whenever you've got a country, that's rife with, what some would call terrorist organizations and terrorist sympathies. All of a sudden you take away their food, you take away their job, you take away their health care, and all you've done is create more terrorists. And of course, Trump, like they've done with everything, whether it's tariffs against Canada, who apparently is a threat to us, or taking away food from poor Palestinians, they say, well, we're going to roll some of this aid back out as long as we can prove that it helps our national security. Well, one, like the Palestinian fisherman said, aid should go beyond that. Feeding people who go without should go beyond your political goals and everything. But this is, it's the lesson that has played it and borne itself out, throughout all of history, but in very, stark examples, going back to our invasion of Iraq and the mess that we created there. And that whenever you bring more strife to a disadvantaged people and you paint yourself as that target, you create more danger for yourself or for your allies. In this case, is that the Palestinians don't necessarily have means to attack America, but this is not going to make them let up with attacks on Israel, right? And there's a great example of this that I kind of witnessed secondhand, not firsthand, was the tsunami that hit in the Pacific back in, was 2004, I believe it was. One of my theology professors, his training before he went to seminary was in engineering, and so he went over to some of the from the islands in the Pacific. I want to say it was Indonesia, but don't hold me to that. But he went over there and helped with some of the rebuilding and stuff to put his engineering education to work. In terms of helping them rebuild their infrastructure and alleviate the flood damage. And of course, the U.S. Army was a big part of the humanitarian relief effort there. We choppered in and flew in all sorts of food and blankets and other kind of immediate needs. And the kids there, and I've heard not only my professor tell the story, but I heard President Clinton tell it the same story one time in a speech. While he was there, the kids there drew pictures of U.S. Army helicopters. Like that was what, and then, bringing in airlifting food and emergency medicine and supplies to them. Like that was, who the kids looked up to. And he even had an older Muslim man come up to him and say, whenever I turn on my television, and keep in mind this tsunami was not too long after the invasion of Iraq, and I turn on the TV and I see those American soldiers, marching across the desert in Iraq, and I think those are bad men. But then I see these same soldiers flying in this aid and relief, and I think to myself, those are good men. People in West Berlin didn't flee en masse to East Berlin. It went the other way around. Whenever we as Americans provide aid and charity, and we do it in a responsible manner that is effective, that is a huge boon to our national security and to our standing and safety in the world. And again, even if it wasn't, it's the right thing to do. We have the means to help, and it doesn't make sense for us not to do it. And it's inexcusable to use poor Palestinians as a political football. Again, I understand that things like the money that gets sent to foreign governments, those are potentially legitimate political bargaining chips. But humanitarian aid administered through charities, not so much. We need to be better than this, and this is something that we need to speak out for and not let Mr. Trump paint America as a nation that's okay with this. So moving on from that, let's stick with Trump here. And I wanted to be hopeful when I read this headline, but ultimately, when you dive into it, you find out that there's not really anything encouraging about it at all. Basically, I'm sure if you followed the news lately, you've seen that Trump has been threatening a government shutdown over his willingness to, or over his desire to see a wall built. He's okay with shutting the government down if that wall isn't funded. We've seen this tactic before, shutting the government down over Obamacare being repealed, or over Planned Parenthood funding. I think was one that Ted Cruz did. But what's strange about this, though, is that the wall, although it's a huge talking point for Trump, it's not really a big important policy, right? Like if it happens, obviously, I don't think it's going to be beneficial, but it doesn't have like huge, far-reaching ramifications and negative consequences. It does have some negative consequences, but it's not this really, really important, like fundamental change in American policy. It doesn't reshape the government. But so it seems then like a really silly thing to threaten a government shutdown over. And it seems like GOP leaders in Congress agree. Which it's like you think, oh, we've got a little cat fight here. We're finally seeing, a fissure between the president and his colleagues in the Senate and in Congress. And so obviously Democrats in the Senate and in Congress attack this on, for real reasons. But the thing is, elections are coming up and Republicans are desperate to hold on to their majority, which is tough to do whenever you have an incompetent buffoon in the White House that represents your party. And so they several Republicans have pointed out, like, hey, we've got an uncharacteristically good relationship with Democrats right now. Actually, they've been passing spending bills left and right. I think out of 12 appropriations that they're supposed to pass this year, they've already passed 7. Because it's funny, they came to power by stymieing up the whole system, but now that they're in power, they need it to work, right? Like whenever you're in power and you break the system, that typically doesn't play well. And so Democrats, apparently to their credit, are more interested in running the government than they are scoring points. And so they haven't been shutting down Republican efforts to pass basic spending bills. And, the government has chugged along. The problem is, though, that the Republicans that have kind of spoken out against this, against Mr. Trump, have kind of tipped their hand. And that's so just for example, Mitch McConnell is always great for a quote, was quoted as saying to a group of reporters, most Republicans, including myself, agree that we ought to fund the wall. We're going to try to achieve that in the course of regular order process. It's all unfolding before you, and we hope we don't get to that position before the end of the year. So there's the idea that, the way he said it is just like, yeah, listen, we want to pass the wall, we want to fund the wall, but that's not what these bills are about. These bills are about, the spending in the budget and regular government operation. It's not time for us to shut down the government over something like this, completely ignoring, of course, the numerous times his party shut down the government over single issues during the spending bill appropriation phase. But other leaders were a little bit more honest, whether that was intentional or unintentional, about why they are speaking out against the president's willingness to shut down the government over this. So from one of McConnell's top deputies in the Senate, John Thune of South Dakota, told reporters that, certainly 30 days before an election, having the prospect of a government shutdown out there is not something I certainly would look forward to have happening. Then Majority Whip John Cornyn from Texas said that President Trump has privately agreed to put off a potential showdown or any fight over the border wall until after midterm elections. So they make it clear. It's not that they're concerned about running the government. It's not that the well-being of the United States is more important than pandering to the base and scoring brownie points to keep them ginned up into hysteria. They just want it to happen after the election so they don't lose more seats, because they know that it ultimately doesn't pay well. Because it turns out that the citizens of the United States of America, generally speaking, have an easier go of things whenever the government works. Which is, the fundamental plank of the Republican Party is that's not true. But the data bears it out, both in terms of, the quality of life and in terms of how people vote immediately after a shutdown. So that's kind of, there's, it would have been nice to see a fissure between the Senate and congressmen and President Trump. Would have been great to see members of the GOP grow a spine and finally stand up to this guy who's running not only the country, but their party into the ground. Unfortunately, it's all about politics to the guys that are supposedly, at odds with him on this. And it has nothing to do with the well-being of the American people. So moving on from that, we'll get into one more story here. So I'm sure you guys, if you follow the news, you've heard the controversy around the census. There's been some questionable decisions made regarding inquiries as to citizenship on census forms that are kind of working their way through the courts. But before we can even get to whether or not the questions on the census are constitutional, well, first off, we have to have a government that's competent enough to get the census documents printed. So a report from the Government Publishing Office during an audit and investigation has concluded that the GPO did not do an adequate job of protecting the interest of the government concluded former Inspector General Michael Raponi, who has since left his position after this report, after his investigation came out. Now, maybe don't read too much into that. He'd been there since 2011. The guy before him came in 2007 and left in 2011. So he had pretty much, run his course of natural tenure there. This may not have been a protest resignation, or he may not have seen the writing on the wall. This may have just been time in his career for him to move on. But back to the story. Basically, what the report found was, and again, this is reported by NPR, there was a high degree of disregard for GPO practices and procedures. So what do those include? Well, the GPO awarded a contract worth $61 million to the printing company Cinvio in October of 2017. Less than 4 months later, so right around the beginning of 2018, Cinvio filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So we awarded a $61 million contract to someone to print a document for a printing job for something that has to be delivered. It's in the Constitution. Every X number of years, every 10 years, we've got to deliver the census. And the census is, this may seem like a funny story, but this is a really important development with far-reaching implications. So the census, although, it's just a count, it's not, maybe as sexy as some other policies and other things the government does is, but that speaks to the nature of government, right? Like the devil's in the details, and good government is based on getting those details right. A lot of the funding decisions that are made about the government rely on the census to make those decisions. So everything from, the number of grants that get awarded and how big those grants are, infrastructure projects and spending, even down to, the number of congressmen you have in a given state, or how many voting districts you have. Those are all based on the census. And so if you can't do the census right, there's a lot of fundamental government levels that affect our everyday lives that we're going to have issues with. So what happened after we awarded this contract and the company went bankrupt? They launched an investigation, and they found out that after the government took bids, for whatever reason, they allowed Cinvio to lower their bid to become more competitive against some of the other bids, which is a breach of protocol that they don't normally allow you to do in any kind of bid process or RFP process. And as well beyond that, before they awarded the bid, they didn't even inspect Cinvio's financial standing. So, keep in mind, you want to go take out maybe a $500 loan or whatever because you have some kind of financial difficulty that comes up. Man, you want to get your credit score checked. You got to have proof of your address, where you've been for X number of years. You got to bring in 7 months worth of paychecks, your birth certificate. You get your blood tested. You got to get your fingerprints or whatever. Maybe have them make a dental mold. There's all sorts of burdens of proof that they put on regular citizens, right, to get loans, and for good reason sometimes. But apparently the federal government, before it hands out a $61 million contract for a project that dictates, how the government's going to be run for the next 10 years, you can't be bothered to check and make sure that the company actually has enough liquid assets to stay functioning over the course of a 3 or 4 year contract. So that report broke in March of 28th. And like I say, since the end of March, the Raponi, the Inspector General there, has left, General Counsel, not Inspector General. So now we're less than 2 years. Gosh, we're barely a year out from the census, I guess. I forget what month it happens in 2010, but we're less than 2 years out from the census, and we don't have a contract out for anyone to print the thing. So keep in mind, there's 300 million people in America, give or take, and that's a lot of copies that have to be printed out and distributed and given to the right people. And there's a lot of work on the front end that goes into that. There's a lot of work in just the census workers that go and hand those out, especially after we saw it get politicized under Mr. Obama, where conservative figures literally encouraged Americans not to fill it out or to lie on it. But now we don't even have somebody lined up to print the thing. And on top of that, not only do we not have somebody lined up to print the thing, but we still got to pay money to this company that went bankrupt. So far, the Census Bureau has agreed to pay $5.5 million to Cinvio to resolve all the disputes related to the contract's end. So we gave these people a bid after we let them break the rules and lower their bid after the fact, and then we didn't bother to check, what their financial standings were. So now they're closing up shop, and they're going to take us for at least $5.5 million. That's what we as American taxpayer are on the hook for. More so, it might even end up being more than that. They've submitted 13 invoices to the GPO for payment. Now the GPO hasn't paid any of those. It looks like they're trying to make a stand and not go above the $5.5 million that they're paying this company for nothing. But it's even if that's it, it's not a great, it's not a good look. This is, again, man, we've whenever it comes to government, it's important to actually want to govern and to care about the details. This is one of the big issues. And again, this is not, necessarily a life or death issue like some of the things that we, raise alarms about are. But the thing is that the whole concept of running the government like a business is such a foundationally flawed premise. And this is a perfect example of it. In business, risk and reward are big factors. You take higher risk if the potential for higher reward is there. And so, if you can get a dirt cheap contract to do something or whatever, and you would like to think that a business would still do its due diligence and check their financial standing, but they don't always do that. There is that sense, though, a business exists to increase profits. That's what they exist for. And some businesses are run, altruistically, some aren't. But the reason, a business's goal, what decisions are made for, are what investments can I make that get me the best return on my money? And sometimes that means risk and reward. A government's role is to advocate and govern, for the well-being of its citizens and its people. And that's why governments move slowly, and what's why there's bureaucracy. People gripe about bureaucracy all the time, but there's a reason for it. It creates a situation where big, rash decisions can't be made quickly. And maybe you miss out on some opportunities to either make a lot of money or save a lot of money there. But you also miss out on a lot of opportunities to leave the American taxpayer holding the bag on a bad investment. And so that's this is just kind of a very kind of, brass tacks example of that, of whenever you elect people who run on, one, how much they don't want to govern, and two, what governing they want to do as a business. Then you elect a bunch of incompetent people. And quite frankly, the guy we elected this time was an incompetent businessman. The one success he had was in selling his brand, his name. And, if it wasn't for reality television and signage, Donald Trump would be broke right now. Nobody would know who he is, because a business that actually produced things and made things of substance is something he's never been able to do. For God's sake, the guy couldn't keep a casino solvent. And this is where we're at in America, that we're at a place where getting to stick it to the people we don't like is more important than the well-being of our country. So that's it for today, guys. A little bit shorter show. I apologize for the technical difficulties we had at the top of the hour. Hopefully that won't happen again. Please share the show, retweet, leave us plenty of messages in the chats and the comments. And I will be your host tomorrow. Hopefully I'll have a little bit more time to be more prepared and be able to do right by you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Jeff should be back next week. Good night and God bless.